There's a very particular kind of vindication that arrives years too late to actually matter socially for the person involved, but still matters enormously for anyone trying to understand what genuinely happened underneath all the noise. This week, King Charles sat in a room with Archie and Lilibet for the first time in 4 years. No William present, Harry reportedly having agreed to stay silent about the details. Most coverage called it healing, a breakthrough, grace finally extended. But there's a woman who described almost exactly this scenario years before it happened.
For years now, folks, we've been fed this shiny, polished-up fairy tale about how my half-sister Meghan waltzed into royal life like some kind of scripted rom-com.
Named the children specifically, named the access specifically, explained the mechanism that would eventually produce it. She got dismissed as bitter, irrelevant, cashing in on a famous relative. Her name is Samantha Markle. And the gap between what she said and what's now being confirmed is genuinely worth walking through properly. Let's actually start where this entire story genuinely begins, though.
Archie was allegedly born, that he said that she had picked up her frozen eggs. So I thought, well, it kind of makes sense, all things taken together, that there would be a surrogate involved.
Not with Samantha directly, but with a single image from May 2018 that ended up doing considerably more structural work than almost anyone watching at the time realized it was doing. Windsor Castle, wedding day. Every camera in the world pointed at one woman walking alone across the grounds. No husband, no visible family around her. Just Doria Ragland, composed, dressed in mint green. That single image became something considerably bigger than a nice photograph. It became a foundation the entire Sussex public brand would rest on for years afterward. The contrast mattered enormously, and it wasn't accidental. That same day, Thomas Markle was embroiled in public chaos. Staged paparazzi photos, missed flights, competing interviews, the Markle side of the story spiraling out of anyone's control.
I would just say that there is so much water under the bridge and so much has spun out of control that was never intended to, and I think everybody was hurt.
Doria's quiet walk through those grounds landed specifically because of what surrounded it. From that moment forward, she functioned as something closer to a protective shield built directly into the brand. Criticize Meghan's character, and by implication you were criticizing the woman who shaped it. That protection held for years, largely because Doria never gave anyone anything to work with. Not one unscripted appearance, not one uncontrolled quote. The public version of Doria, warm, simple, devoted, the quiet single mother who raised a daughter alone with grace, was entirely, consistently managed. Here's the problem with a narrative built that carefully around a real person. Anyone who actually knew that person from inside the same household is going to notice the gap between the sold version and the lived one.
I'm not taking it personally, nor am I holding that against her.
I think a lot of people would take that very personally. You're a member of the family. How hurt have you and the other members of the family been?
It's genuinely worth pausing on why this specific brand foundation worked as well as it did for as long as it did. The public narrative offered something clean and emotionally satisfying. A self-made woman who'd overcome a complicated family situation, raised by a single mother whose quiet dignity contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding everyone else in her orbit. That's a genuinely compelling story, the kind that generates real sympathy and real loyalty from an audience.
Family have received invites, nor have Doria's family. So although we don't understand, we can only wish them well, but I'm not taking it personally, nor am I holding that against her.
The problem with any narrative built that cleanly, though, is that clean narratives tend to simplify complicated realities, and complicated realities have a way of eventually resurfacing regardless of how carefully the simpler version has been managed. Samantha Markle noticed exactly this gap. And critically, she didn't just mention it once when press attention suited her. She kept returning to specific, checkable details across years. Thomas Markle, she pointed out repeatedly, raised Meghan from roughly age 12 through 18 as the primary parent, not an occasional presence, but the one paying for private schooling, driving her to auditions, funding the early career now credited almost entirely to Meghan's own drive. Doria's presence during those specific years, according to Samantha's consistent account, was considerably more intermittent than the devoted single mother narrative allowed for.
I think that Doria's got more control of Meghan than Harry, that's for sure. I think there's something going on there. Two peas in a pod, I'd say.
If this breakdown is holding your attention, the like button genuinely helps this channel keep digging into stories most coverage doesn't bother chasing this far. I want to flag something important about how to weigh Samantha's claims fairly, because it matters for the rest of this story. She's not a neutral source. She has her own complicated history with this family, and her own possible motivations for speaking publicly and repeatedly. That's worth holding on to throughout. What makes her specific claims harder to dismiss purely as bitterness, though, is the consistency critics point to. She kept naming the same gaps, the same timeline problems, year after year, rather than drifting into vaguer, more emotional territory the way pure resentment often does over time. That consistency doesn't prove she's right about everything, but it's a genuinely different pattern than simple grievance tends to produce.
Between Meghan Markle and her own mother, Doria Ragland, she has been completely miserable in the last couple of public appearances that the fake Duchess forced on her.
The media's response, regardless, stayed constant. Dismiss, bury, move on, which meant the actual gaps she kept pointing at never got seriously examined. Not because they'd been disproven, but because almost nobody bothered looking. While the public conversation stayed fixed on dismissing Samantha, something else was quietly happening that essentially no outlet covering this family in real time actually caught. In 2022, Doria Ragland, whose entire public identity had been built around being a yoga teacher and social worker, someone the brand had spent years presenting as existing outside the world of commerce entirely, reportedly took on 3 executive titles simultaneously at a Delaware-registered company connected to Meghan: CEO, CFO, and Secretary. No press release. No announcement. The same outlets that had spent years analyzing Meghan's nail polish at public appearances apparently missed all 3 titles landing at once.
This is indicative that money is not rolling in for Harry and Meghan. I would argue that this shows that the Netflix deal has been severely rescinded. I would argue that As Ever is completely and utterly flopping and failing and not bringing in any money.
Delaware incorporation isn't casual paperwork. It's a specific legal jurisdiction chosen deliberately for liability protection, tax structure, and privacy, the kind of decision made by people who understand exactly what they're building. And the timing lines up with a genuinely consequential period, the exact window when Meghan was rebuilding her commercial identity after stepping back from royal duties, when structural decisions carried real long-term weight. Around that same general period, Doria was reportedly presented publicly as the recipient of the very first jar of strawberry jam from Meghan's As Ever brand, before any celebrity, any influencer, before anyone else. The symbolism was warm and perfectly pitched. She's the person this was really all for.
Now, you'll know things have not been good between these two for some time. Doria is certainly these days less inclined.
That jam jar told one story. The Delaware filing, if accurate, told a genuinely different one. The distance between those two versions is exactly the kind of gap Samantha had reportedly been pointing at for years, sitting in public records the whole time, waiting for anyone to actually look. It's worth being fair to the alternative explanation here too, before moving forward. Corporate structures involving family members aren't inherently suspicious on their own. Plenty of legitimate family businesses have parents or relatives holding formal executive titles specifically because trusted family involvement makes practical sense for privacy and continuity reasons, entirely separate from any deceptive intent. It's entirely possible these titles reflect exactly that kind of ordinary, sensible arrangement rather than anything resembling the gap between public image and private structure that critics are pointing toward.
Say Ragland's departure has left Markle 43 and Prince Harry 40 struggling to adjust without her.
The Delaware filing alone doesn't prove intent to deceive. What it does prove is that the simple, singular public image was, at minimum, incomplete. Now let's talk about what happened once the commercial plan Meghan had reportedly built her post-royal identity around started genuinely struggling. Because that's apparently where Doria's role shifted from primarily symbolic to something considerably more operationally central. The Spotify deal, reportedly worth $20 million and announced as proof the Sussex brand carried genuine independent market value, ended after a single season, officially attributed to creative differences. A creative disagreement doesn't typically end a partnership that abruptly. That specific pattern tends to look more like one side simply deciding not to continue.
No, I choose people who don't want to be written about on the whole. and whose lives are shrouded in mystery. And they've climbed the greasy pole. They want to be famous, they want to be influential, they want to be powerful.
Netflix reportedly canceled Pearl, the animated series meant to establish serious content creation credentials, before a single episode aired. The broader pattern, according to multiple reports, was straightforward. The commercial ventures meant to anchor Sussex independence were struggling to produce work that survived actual market scrutiny. Into that specific pressure, Doria reportedly moved in full-time, not a visiting grandmother, but by multiple accounts something closer to operationally central to how that household functioned, day to day. One source close to the situation reportedly put it plainly: Harry found something in her presence that his own side of the family had never quite provided.
And now presents her mother, Doria, speaking for the first time, telling outright lies about her ex-husband. I mean, this was a calculated attempt against the family.
For roughly 18 months, according to these accounts, she was there, almost entirely invisible publicly. No appearances, no quotes. Then, reportedly, exhaustion set in. A dynamic between mother and daughter that had apparently worn past sustainable daily proximity. One source close to the household reportedly described it without much softening. She'd grown tired of her own daughter's constant complaints and drama. Not palace pressure, not tabloid intrusion, not any of the external forces this family's public narrative has traditionally pointed to as the source of its difficulties. The fracture, in this reading, came from inside. Meghan reportedly asked her not to leave. Doria reportedly packed her bags and went anyway.
Because she felt that they were using her too much, going out, getting her to cook, go and buy the shopping. She's not a very young woman anymore, and although she would want to help.
It's also worth acknowledging directly that family estrangements involving elderly or aging parents and adult children are genuinely common, complicated, and rarely reducible to a single clean villain. Plenty of families experience exactly this kind of accumulated exhaustion after extended periods of close proximity, entirely separate from any broader narrative about brand management or image control. If this specific departure happened roughly as described, it may simply reflect ordinary family strain rather than anything more calculated. Now here's where the story becomes genuinely stranger though, because of how differently two entirely separate situations were reportedly handled by the same team managing this family's public image. In December 2025, a broadcaster reportedly made a false on-air claim about Doria Ragland. The response was immediate and significant. Over 800 formal complaints filed, a live on-air apology issued, substantial coverage generated. That's what this operation looks like when it decides something genuinely requires a response.
No wonder Prince William wants nothing to do with his younger brother who has become a disgrace.
6 months earlier, according to these same accounts, Doria had reportedly walked out of the Montecito household entirely. The woman described in Meghan's own Netflix content as central to her emotional world, gone. No statement, no comment, nothing. The same team that filed 800 complaints over a false broadcast claim reportedly said absolutely nothing when she actually left. That's not necessarily a contradiction once you think through what each situation actually threatened. A false criminal allegation risked damaging the specific public image the brand still needed Doria to represent. Explaining an actual departure honestly would have cost considerably more than simply staying silent about it. If you're finding this level of detail genuinely useful, subscribing helps make sure you don't miss where this story goes next. There are other signals worth naming too. Sitting in plain sight on platforms this team manages with real precision. On Mother's Day 2025, Meghan reportedly posted 2 expensive scented candles to Instagram accounts named after her own children, with no acknowledgement of Doria anywhere in the post. In her own Netflix series, which she produced and controlled entirely, she reportedly described her mother using exactly 2 words: free spirit. Warm sounding on its surface, but inside a show built entirely around themes of nurturing, presence, and intentional domestic warmth, that specific phrasing arguably positions Doria as something outside that value system rather than embodying it. By the second season, according to multiple reports, Doria simply wasn't present in the content at all, with no explanation offered. Samantha had reportedly been describing this exact pattern: elevation, deployment, disappearance, years before any of these specific moments existed publicly. Then came Tom Bower, And I think his involvement genuinely matters here in a way that's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as just another critical voice. Bauer has spent 4 decades building a reputation as one of Britain's most credible investigative biographers, taking on figures like Robert Maxwell and Conrad Black, people with serious legal resources who'd successfully intimidated other journalists. His reputation rests specifically on sourcing quality and documented accuracy, which is exactly why his eventual conclusions here carry more weight than typical tabloid commentary. Bauer reportedly stated directly, on camera, "I don't mind Harry. It's Meghan I'm after." When his book on the couple was published, Harry and Meghan, a couple who'd previously pursued legal action over a private letter, who'd filed suits across multiple jurisdictions to manage unfavorable coverage, reportedly never sued over it. No statement, no injunction. The palace reportedly said nothing either, which people familiar with how palace communications typically operate read as its own kind of signal. When the institution wants to actively kill a story, it tends to flood the space with competing narratives. Staying quiet often means letting something breathe. Bauer reportedly later said, "Without qualification, we laughed at Samantha and she was right, and everything she said has come true. I want to be genuinely careful here, because that's a strong claim from a credible source, but it's still one man's assessment rather than independently verified fact across every specific detail Samantha has claimed over the years. It's worth taking seriously precisely because of who's making it. It's not automatically proof of every individual thing Samantha has ever said. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, connecting these two moments directly. Public relations operations generally respond loudly to threats that are false but reputationally dangerous, and stay quiet about situations that are true but reputationally costly to explain honestly. That's not a phenomenon unique to this specific family. It's fairly standard crisis communications practice across the entertainment industry generally. What makes this particular contrast notable isn't that the pattern itself is unusual. It's how starkly it plays out when you place the two responses directly beside each other in sequence. Which brings us to Harry specifically, because I think there's a genuinely more complicated and more sympathetic read on him available than the two extremes most coverage tends to settle for. There's an easy version. The prince who walked away from everything, signed the deals, wrote the memoir, watched it all come apart from a mansion in California. That version is available and plenty of people have settled on it. There's a more unsettling version too though, and by multiple accounts from people close to the situation, it holds up. Harry reportedly genuinely didn't see what was apparently being built around him, not from inattention, but because it was allegedly constructed in the legal filings and operational decisions happening in spaces he simply wasn't part of. He reportedly found Doria genuinely stabilizing, in a way people close to the household described as something he hadn't quite experienced from his own side of the family. He reportedly didn't know about any Delaware filings bearing her name. He believed the origin story the same way the rest of the world was given it, carefully constructed, presented as self-evident. What Samantha had been documenting for years, if her account holds up, apparently never reached him in a form he could meaningfully engage with, because the framing around her ensured that if she was simply a bitter relative, nothing she said required serious attention. He reportedly watched commercial projects fail without necessarily connecting them to decisions being made in rooms he wasn't part of. People close to the couple have described the marriage as under sustained, significant pressure throughout this period. And then came Highgrove, where everything Samantha had reportedly been saying for years suddenly had a specific date and a confirmation from the most controlled institution in Britain. Buckingham Palace's actual statement was tightly controlled, saying remarkably little while somehow communicating everything necessary. King Charles and Queen Camilla hosted Prince Harry and Meghan and their 2 children. No timeline, no images, no detail about what was said. Harry reportedly agreed not to speak publicly about it, a significant commitment from a man whose entire post-royal public identity has been built substantially around discussing exactly these kinds of private family moments. William reportedly wasn't there, which landed quietly but landed hard, given everything separately documented about that specific brotherly rift. This wasn't, by most readings, a full family reunion. It was a grandfather meeting grandchildren he hadn't seen in 4 years. Archie and Lilibet, largely invisible publicly, absent from royal events, previously described by critics as functioning as leverage in a father-son relationship reportedly conducted almost entirely through lawyers and statements, were finally, reportedly, in the same room as their grandfather. Samantha had apparently described this specific dynamic repeatedly and specifically. Not a vague prediction that reunions eventually happen, but the particular logic underneath one. Children as the actual mechanism, access as the leverage point, reunion arriving not primarily from goodwill but because withholding it had finally become more costly than whatever it had been protecting. The palace reportedly confirmed the meeting, by most readings, because someone was going to leak it regardless. Controlled disclosure being the institution's standard method of managing information it can't fully contain. There's genuinely something worth sitting with in how differently these two women have chosen to engage with this entire story. One has spoken repeatedly, publicly, and consistently for years, accepting the reputational cost of being labeled bitter and dismissible in exchange for keeping her specific claims in public circulation. The other has maintained complete silence throughout, which is its own kind of choice, carrying its own kind of message, even if that message is simply that she's decided not to participate in any of this publicly regardless of what's being said about her. Samantha Markle, for her part, is still speaking publicly about all of this, consistently, years into a story most people had assumed was long settled. Doria Ragland, by contrast, has reportedly never spoken a single public word about any of it. Not before the wedding, not during, not after. The woman at the center of an origin story that helped build an entire public identity has, by this account, never personally confirmed a single detail of that story herself. None of this constitutes absolute courtroom-grade proof of every specific claim woven across this entire saga. Court documents, sworn testimony under oath, and direct on-record confirmation from the people actually involved would represent the genuine gold standard here, and a considerable portion of what's been laid out tonight rests on reported accounts and secondary sourcing rather than that considerably higher evidentiary bar. But the pattern, if even substantially accurate, is genuinely striking regardless of exactly how each individual detail eventually gets verified. A woman dismissed publicly and repeatedly for years as bitter and irrelevant, describing specific, concrete mechanisms, years before those exact mechanisms reportedly played out in public, in roughly the sequence she'd apparently been describing all along. What do you genuinely think? Does Bauer's public vindication of Samantha meaningfully change how you personally read everything she said publicly over these past several years, or does one biographer's assessment, however credible his broader track record might be, carry considerably less weight than the confident framing around it tends to suggest? And genuinely, separately from that, do you think Harry really and truly didn't know what was reportedly happening around him throughout all of this? Or is that specific reading giving him considerably more benefit of the doubt than the overall situation actually deserves, given his own stated responsibility for the life he chose to build? Let me know honestly in the comments. I'm curious whether people land where I did on this one, or somewhere completely different. And if stories like this one are exactly what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe to Palace Insider, because there's clearly more to this particular thread than any single video can fully cover.